Alright, hello class. This is my video on my analysis of scenes 3 through 5 of Act 1 of Shakespeare's Hamlet. So let's get started. So, in these first few scenes of Hamlet, we're really just setting up for the plot that is yet to come. We are setting up all the different relationships between people in this novel, both dead and alive. Obviously, we already know we have, as a centerpiece, we have Hamlet. Please excuse my terrible drawing here, but it's going to serve a purpose. So the center of this whole thing, we have Hamlet. We know that for a fact. Now, what we also know we have now is this ghost, who's actually his dad, who is the past king. Now his dad was married to the Queen Gertrude. Yes, I think we've established that much. Who has meanwhile gone ahead to marry his uncle, that being Claudius. So that's the family structure for Hamlet. Now, meanwhile, as far as his affection goes, which is something that we begin to discuss in scene 3, we have Ophelia. I'm hoping that's how you pronounce that. And then Ophelia has her own family. Now they are of a somewhat lower class, and that's going to cause some friction for their relationship. And so who does Ophelia have to deal with? Well, there's her brother, Laertes. And their father, Polonius. And so what you're seeing here is pretty much the entire family structure that you will find in Hamlet, at least thus far. So I'm going to go ahead and discuss some of the important points that we see in the different scenes. So in scene 3, we already see some of the friction going on in this relationship here between Ophelia and Laertes, and later on Polonius. It's actually slightly humorous, really, because a lot of what Shakespeare here is describing is some of the general difficulties and ironies of, I guess, family life, and that just the sort of sexist tendencies people had during this time period, because this was written right around 1600. So obviously women's rights were not where they are today. So for one thing, here we have Laertes sort of schooling his sister on how she should behave when confronted with the matter of, shall we say, Hamlet's courtship. He says, "Think it no more, for nature crescent does not grow alone, enthuse in bulk, but as this temple waxes, the inward service of the mind and soul grows wide withal. Perhaps he loves you now, and now no soil nor cottle doth besmirch the virtue of his will, but you must fear his greatness weighed, his will not his own, for he himself is subject to his birth. He may not, as unvalued persons do, carve for himself, for his choice depends on the safety and health of his state. And therefore must his choice be circumscribed unto the voice and yielding of that body, whereof he is the head. So, we could continue, but I think you guys understand my point. So, for example, where do we have it? Yeah, so, see, like, perhaps he loves you now. He's basically making, like, not fun, but he is belittling their relationship. A point that her father is going to repeat to an extent. If I can find that passage. See, now we have Polonius come in. There we go. Yes. Lord Polonius says later on, again to Ophelia, Mary, I'll teach you. Think yourself a baby, that you have ta'en these tenders for true pay, which are not sterling. Tender yourself more dearly, or, not to crack the wind of poor phrase, running it thus, you'll tender me a fool. Now, Ophelia is to an extent resisting their general advice, saying, their relationship is legitimate, such as right here. Her response, my lord, he has opportuned me with love in honorable fashion. And that's all good and well, but in the end, they're the ones who are imploring her to tilt the other cheek to Hamlet. So, there's that, and that's obviously going to cause a considerable struggle for Hamlet, especially when it concerns women in general, because, of course, Hamlet is rather mad right now, in general, with the opposite sex, because he has his mother, who, as I had before in the little diagram, is marrying his uncle very shortly after his father's death, which is, first of all, considered incest, and for another, Hamlet just feels as though her grieving time was far too short, and she just sort of jumped the gun on marrying the uncle. And then at the same time, now he's got this struggle with Ophelia, whose family is urging her to avoid him, and at the same time he has a sort of a class struggle there because they're not on a parallel scale. Scenes 4 and 5, meanwhile, return to the platform, and this is where Hamlet is going to have his first meeting with the ghost of his father. And so the setup of scene 4 is really just Hamlet and his company reaching the platform and waiting for this ghost that Hamlet has thus far not seen. And, this is where they're just sort of convincing him. Again, here we see all these various little dialogues that Shakespeare is having on society in general. For example, here Hamlet is talking about some of the customs, and then, so this would be Hamlet talking about the customs, yes, and then here Hamlet's response to that is basically that, no one actually obeys these customs, and I think that's, in its own sort of way, Shakespeare talking about society in general, how we set ourselves a lot of rules, but then we don't necessarily follow them. So that's sort of a outreach outside of the confines of this story into actual society, and honestly, it's a bit of a universal way of putting things. By the end of scene 4, we meet the ghost, or at least the ghost appears again. And And then, of course, we have a bit of a showing of Hamlet's character, where he says over here, why, what should be the fear? I do not set my life in a pin's fee, and for my soul, what can it do to that, being a thing that, being a thing immortal as itself. It waves me forth again, I'll follow it. So that kind of shows us how, relatively speaking, Hamlet is quite courageous and willing to follow his own path. And then scene 5 is really the big deal for this whole act. This is finally where Hamlet and the ghost of his father get to talk. This is probably the single most important bit right here. I am thy father's spirit. I'm the ghost of your father. So this is where Hamlet's father explains to him the circumstances surrounding his death, at least to an extent. He just says that he was poisoned. But it also confirms a lot of Hamlet's suspicions. For example, about Hamlet's mother. Because Hamlet seems to be the only person that we've met so far that has these negative feelings towards his mother and her short grieving period. And now we see that Hamlet's father feels the same way. Of course he would, he was murdered. And so then here they're just discussing how terrible the actions around the family are. This is all just really the reinforcement for what's going to come up ahead. And towards the end of this scene, we're going to return to the rest of Hamlet's company. We're just going to ask him, what happened in there. He's going to sum that up for them, that he met his father, they discussed things, but he doesn't want them to tell anyone, because obviously there are forces working against him, because after all, they already killed his father. And so later on they're agreeing to that, and that's pretty much it for a summary of what happens here. So what we've learned then from here is, the big points are every time. Alright, so we've got Hamlet's father was murdered. And we also know about the mother's relationship with the uncle. And we also have some insights on Hamlet's romantic life. All of these are points that are likely to be revisited and serve as reinforcement later on throughout the novel. So while there aren't, any major actions taken here besides the discussion between father and son, it's going to provide the background information necessary to understand the rest of the play.